Hi, everybody, and welcome to the NCDS DataBytes Lunchtime Webinar Series. Today's speaker is Kevin Crowston. He is a distinguished professor of information science at the Syracuse University School of Information Studies. Kevin received his AB in Applied Mathematics from Harvard University and holds a PhD in Information Technologies, plural, from the Sloan School of Management at MIT. His research examines new ways of organizing made possible by the use of information technology. And the way he approaches this issue is through empirical studies of coordination-intensive processes in human organizations, especially virtual organizations, and also theoretical characterizations of coordination problems and alternative methods for managing them. He also designs empirical evaluation. I think I'm getting lost here. Also through design and empirical evaluation of systems to support people working together. Specific domains of interest to Kevin include free open source software development projects, citizen science projects, and research data management. His talk today is titled Humans, Machines, and the Future of Citizen Science. As always, the talk will last about 35 to 40 minutes, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end. If you have questions, please feel free to type those questions in the chat box. We'll hold them to the end, and then we'll read them back to the speaker. So thank you, and welcome, Kevin.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be able to give this talk. I'm going to be talking about a project that is actually in its early stages, so hearing from the audience about the parts they find interesting and the questions they have will be enlightening for me also, I hope. As noted, I'm going to be talking about humans, machines, and the future of citizen science, but I'm not certain how familiar people in the audience are with citizen science. I suspect somewhat, but I'm going to start off by giving a brief introduction to the current state of citizen science to illustrate some of the challenges there, and then talk about our current project and the way that we're trying to draw on both humans, people on the one hand, as well as machines, algorithms, and machine learning on the other. So just to start off, citizen science is a very broad term that refers to scientific projects that involve members of the general public as participants. In principle, you could have members of the general public involved at all phases, and it should be noted that I'm talking about participation by non-professional scientists, so using the term citizens in a very, very broad term. There's actually a little bit of discussion around the term citizen science, since it does seem to imply that you need a passport in order to do it. But at this point, it seems a well-accepted term, so I'm just going to use it in this talk. Another term that you might hear as a synonym is public participation in scientific research. And of course, that can span the entire gamut of the scientific process, everything from just finding a question through gathering and analyzing data to interpreting it, coming up with conclusions, and actually perhaps even applying those. And you do see citizen science projects that operate at each of these different points or multiple points, but the majority are focused in the middle, what Shirk and Bonney in their framework described as contributory. So places where the citizens are contributing to the science, but not necessarily in a leading role or even a very strong collaboration. And so that would include cases where we have data being collected by the citizens or being analyzed. As an example of the former, a very noteworthy project is the eBird project from Cornell University, the Lab for Ornithology. And this is a very interesting one because it uses citizens to collect data about the observations of birds. It turns out that birding is an extremely popular hobby. There are many people who do it, Avid birders like to keep lists of the birds they've seen, and so the design very cleverly takes advantage of the desire of the birders to have these good lists to put that data to use for science. And obviously there are many, many more birders than there are ornithologists, and so the use of something like eBird allows you to get data that covers a much broader area than professionals could cover. There's a number of other projects, especially in environmental sciences, that have that same kind of feature, using the interests of the public and the fact that there are many more members of the public with much broader distribution to get a much better data set about what's going on. One of the interesting things here is that in order to make the data useful for science, you actually need a little bit more than just the observations, because at face value, the data from eBird would suggest that there are lots of birds in cities and very few birds in North Dakota. But in fact, that's because there are a lot of birders in cities and there aren't that many birders in North Dakota, or actually people in general. So by gathering a little bit of additional data, which is not directly useful for the birders in keeping lists, but is very, very important for the ornithologists, you can actually convert these observations through the application of a lot of fairly sophisticated statistical modeling, which actually is quite interesting in its own right, into, for example, maps like this that indicate the occurrence of a particular species at a particular time of the year. And if you go to the eBird site, they have these beautiful animations where you can actually see the birds flooding into North America in the spring and leaving again in the fall, or actually in some cases vice versa. So a lot of insight. And that data has actually been extremely useful, not only to support research, but also to support policy making, looking at things like habitat and how that affects the birds. So that's the case where we're collecting the data. I'm mostly in this talk going to be focusing on the other case, which is analyzing data, because in a lot of sciences these days, the problem is not so much getting the data as dealing with the enormously large amounts of data that are being collected by automated instruments. And astronomy is kind of a poster child in that case, especially with satellite observations such as the Hubble Space Telescope, but actually pretty much all telescopes these days are automated. The amount of data that is flooding in is it's basically as much data every night as in the entire history of astronomy. And there's a lot of interesting things that you can do with that data. And one project I'm going to start with just looked at galaxies. So you can see these beautiful photos taken of galaxies by the Hubble. And a very simple question, how many galaxies are there of different shapes? So if you were an astronomy professor and you had that question, you might get some of the photos of the Hubble and start to look through them. But chances are that the professor wouldn't have time to go through a very large number, so maybe 100 or so. Faced with that, you might have difficulty putting together a good paper. One of the first papers that actually addressed a question like that actually had 10,000. So you can see a couple of orders of magnitude more than the professor would be able to do. So, of course, what professors do in that situation is they hire graduate students. And in this case, actually, there was a project with two astronomers at Oxford who actually, one of them was a PhD student and in the course of a month or so managed to analyze 50,000 of these galaxies. But that's dwarfed by the amount of data that the telescope has collected. So upwards of 1.5 million galaxy images, which is completely out of scale with the amount of effort that a person can put into it. So these guys had the idea of making a citizen science project out of it. And the way they did that was by putting up a site, which I think many people will now know about, called Galaxy Zoo, that basically, as you can see, put up an image of the galaxy in the middle, and then asked a few very simple questions about it. Later versions of the system are more sophisticated and ask a larger set of questions. And then put that out to the public, looking essentially for volunteers. And again, taking advantage of the fact that there are many amateur astronomers who have a strong interest in the universe and who would be interested in seeing the images of the galaxies and contributing to science. They expected to get perhaps 100 or so volunteers and thinking about the months of effort that it had taken to get 50,000, figuring that it would take a year or so to analyze it. They were stunned when, within the first couple of hours of the site, they had actually thousands of volunteers, so many, in fact, that the server crashed. And this chart, I think, sums it up quite nicely. Across the bottom, you have the number of hours in the first 2 days of the project, and you can see that within just half a day, they were analyzing every hour as much data as in the previous publications. And the somewhat sobering moment is the point a couple days later where every hour they're analyzing as much as the doctoral student, Kevin, had done in a month. So that kind of multiplication of ability, taking advantage essentially of the volunteered labor of the crowd, really brought home the potential of this mode. There's obviously lots of design considerations around this, but you can see the potential. And that data, of course, has been extremely useful for scientific research. There's a number of papers. This is one of the earlier ones, looking again at this question of morphology. You can see the range of people who are involved. One of the interesting side effects, though, of having individuals, humans, look at all of these images was that they were able to identify things that would not have been picked up in an automated analysis. So in particular, things like this. So you can see the lovely picture of the galaxy on the left, but then on the right-hand side, there's this sort of funny green blob attacking it, and that was originally noticed by one of the volunteers on the Galaxy Zoo project, and has actually been named after her. So this is called Hanny's Voorwerp, named after Hanny van Arkel, who is a Dutch school teacher and a very, very active member of the Zooniverse project. And the thing that's interesting to note is that the discovery of these objects isn't necessarily something supported by the main system, which is focused on the classifications, the shape and morphology, but in fact happens through these alternative channels that get built up around the system. So the discussion boards and so on, where people are able to discuss what they're seeing as they're analyzing the images. And so again, if you thought about applying automation, it would capture that mainstream, but not necessarily this other one. Another interesting thing about this is that the paper that describes it, Hanny's Voorwerp, which by the way is Dutch for object, actually includes Hanny as one of the authors. So down here, the fourth author, Hanny van Arkel, who is affiliated with the Dutch school system, it says. So that's a case where we're using the volunteered effort of members of the public to actually help with the data analysis, in this case a fairly simple kind of analysis. The success of that project led the people who started Galaxy Zoo, Chris Lintott, and others, to found something called the Zooniverse, which actually is trying to apply this model in a much broader sense. And at this point, there are several dozen projects, and in fact, there's a project builder so you can build your own. A number of those are still in astronomy, like a fairly successful one that's been looking for evidence of planets using data from, I've actually forgotten the satellites that the data come from, but looking at the evidence of a planet transiting in front of a remote star as evidence of an extrasolar planet. And to date, they've actually discovered quite a number of those. But also in a variety of other sciences. So, for example, one looking at images from camera traps on the Serengeti, another from images taken by a submersible on the sea bottom, again doing this classification of what's being observed. And even in other domains a little bit more remote, like medicine, looking for evidence of cancer, or history. Having people look at ship's logs and code the data that's in there as a way of getting at historic weather patterns. So actually looking at the fine notes and writing down. And actually, in this one also, there's this sort of interesting possibility for serendipity. So discovering things noted in the log that are not necessarily about the weather, but which are still of interest, like observations of comets, reports about plagues, and so on. So that's a brief history of citizen science. What I want to spend the rest of the talk talking about is a new project that we're developing where we're actually trying to develop sort of the next generation of citizen science projects. And this is a project in collaboration with Northwestern University and a number of others involved with the LIGO project, which I'll describe in just a sec, as well as with the Zooniverse. So the Zooniverse is one of our partners in this. So basically, the reason that these analysis projects like Galaxy Zoo started in the first place is that the images that were being studied were ones which were not very amenable to machine processing. So in principle, you could develop some kind of image processing algorithm that would go through all of these images, but many of the images, you know, the galaxy's in a weird orientation, or the image is quite faint and hard to make out, and the machine reliability at the time was quite low. But in the past 5 or so years, there's been this enormous improvement in the capabilities of machine vision, in particular, machine processing. And just as an example, this is a challenge to identify the contents of an image. There's 1,000 different classes of image. And the best systems these days, which are these neural networks, actually these data are a few years old, as you can see, are getting up to 88% accuracy in doing that classification. So being able to identify a mite, a container ship, a motor scooter, or so on. And even in cases where the system doesn't agree with the label that has been applied, as in the lower left, the answers that it comes up with don't seem unreasonable. So, for example, the lower left image was coded as being a grill, the front part, but the machine thought it was a convertible, which in fact I think many humans would have agreed with. Similarly, with a mushroom, the system has actually picked a better label. So even there, some of the mistakes that are recorded as mistakes are ones that seem reasonable. So given that enormous increase in the capability, the question is how you could actually incorporate that into some kind of processing in a new generation of citizen science. So one way that people often think about this is essentially as replacements. So it turns out that in order to do this sort of classification, the predominant mode these days is a machine learning approach. So rather than trying to develop an algorithm that does the classification from scratch, you basically start off with a big pile of classified data. So for example, on that previous slide, millions of images that are labeled as being container ships, scooters, or so on, and you learn from that. You develop some kind of classification system that's basically been trained on the classified data. And so typically that classified data would come from human classification. And of course, these days, rather than having just 1 or 2 people do the classification, it might be this sort of crowdsourced. So you could definitely think about having some kind of system where you would start off with the citizens doing their classification. They would create a pile of classified data, and eventually you'd have a machine learning algorithm that would be able to replace them. So as I said, we're looking at these possibilities of using machine learning, and we're doing it in the context of the LIGO project, which is what I want to describe next. So basically, the LIGO project is a detector that's looking for evidence of gravitational waves. Those were predicted by Einstein in 1916. Basically, the notion is if you have 2 massive objects, actually, there's a number of different ways it can happen, but the one that's most expected is 2 massive objects, like 2 black holes or 2 neutron stars that are orbiting each other. And as they do that, they send ripples out through space-time. So basically, space-time itself gets warped by gravity, and so moving objects cause the warping to move as well. And so you end up with this ripples floating out. but the distortions are incredibly, incredibly faint, very, very tiny. In order to detect those, you need to have a very sensitive instrument. And so what LIGO is a pair of laser interferometers, which is basically an L 4 kilometers on a side. And what happens is that light gets sent down the two arms of the detector, and then recombined, bounced off a mirror, recombined. It's actually a little more complicated, but essentially that's the idea. By looking at the way that the light interferes with itself when it comes back, you're able to detect these slight changes in the length of the arms of the detector. And the system can actually detect shifts in the length 1/1000th the diameter of a proton. So just these incredibly, incredibly minute distortions in the length of the arms of the detector. And in fact, there's a pair of detectors, one in Washington State, one in Louisiana, and basically by looking for signals that arrive at both of those, you can detect, that it did come from some astrophysical event. As well, you can get some information about roughly the direction, etc. And in fact, I'm sure many people heard the news that was announced about January that, in fact, the detector had detected the first evidence of colliding black holes that create this particular kind of waveform. And so you can see the waveform recorded on the left in Hanford, Washington, on the right in Livingston, Louisiana. And in fact, what you see at the bottom of the page is this spectrographic representation where we have time going from left to right, we have frequency going from bottom to top, and then the color indicates the intensity of the signal at that frequency. So you can see that the signal sort of starts off with a lower intensity and a lower frequency, and as the frequency increases, so does the amplitude, and so you get this sort of characteristic upward swoop that turns brighter colors. And what's happening is that in this case it was two black holes, they're orbiting around each other, which gives you that wave, but they're spiraling in towards each other, and they eventually collide. And as they get closer and closer, they go faster and faster with more and more energy. So you get that swooping noise. So as I said, the system was able to successfully detect evidence of gravitational waves and of black holes. But the incredible sensitivity that makes it possible to detect a signal that's come from millions of light years away also means that the detector is sensitive to noise, lots and lots and lots of different sources of noise. Earthquakes, the wind blowing hard, people walking nearby, cars going by. And so these events are expected to happen on the order of, once a month or so. But some other kind of noise, like this particular example, happen about every 3 seconds or so. So there's just an awful lot of these background noise events that get in the way of being able to detect the gravitational event. So at a minimum, you would like to be able to identify that something is not actually likely to be because of some astrophysical event. And there are some things you can do, for example, like coincidence in timing. If you don't have a signal in both detectors, then it's probably terrestrial. But they happen often enough that there's still quite a lot of coincidences. So you'd like to be able to at least filter them out. Even better, you would like to be able to identify these glitches, as they're called, these noise events that have a similar shape and probably come from a similar cause, and then identify where in the detector they're being created in order to eliminate them, so as to have a cleaner signal to analyze. But the volume of these is so great that the LIGO scientists can't possibly look through them all and identify what they are, or identify more than a handful of kinds. So at the moment, their work, they've identified a dozen or so, 20 or so. But it's expected that there are more, but just the volume of data is such that it's hard to deal with. So this seemed like an obvious approach for citizen science. And in fact, our team, the Gravity Spy team as we call it, have created, using the Zooniverse project builder, a citizen science project that asks the volunteers to classify the different kinds of glitches into these categories. And so you can see here we have the spectrograph again. You'll notice that this one doesn't look very much like the gravitational event because it's not that upward swoop. It's just a sharp blip of noise. And then on the right-hand side, we have the various categories that it could be in. And I should have mentioned that in the Zooniverse project, the typical mode is to have multiple volunteers look at each image and then form some kind of consensus to come up with the overall pattern. So as I said, this is sort of a traditional mode of a citizen science project, but we were actually quite interested in the ways that you could use machine learning to augment this kind of a system. And the first thing we noticed was that there are a lot of these images that are actually not that controversial and not that difficult to deal with. So we came up with an architecture in which we actually incorporated an initial machine learning stage, and you can see that on the right-hand side of the figure there in purple. So the basic idea is that we get from the LIGO project this collection of potential glitches, but we first run them through a machine learning model that has been trained on some number of gold standard data. That's on the bottom in the middle in aqua. So we have a set of gold standard glitches that initially were coded by some of the experts involved with the LIGO project. And that gives us a set of models which have, they're not perfect, but the interesting point is that they have different degrees of confidence in their classification. So some of the glitches they're very certain are, for example, blips like this one, or koi fish, or power lines, or any of the other 20. And ones that are pretty certain don't necessarily need to have as much human classification. They can, in fact, be classified confidently with a lot less effort. And what that means is that we can then take the ones that the machine learning model has problems with and send those to the humans to work on. So that's one of the first innovations. It's just using the machine learning model to reduce the amount of data that needs this sort of detailed attention from the humans. So rather than the humans spending an equal amount of effort on all of the images, reserving their effort for the more difficult ones. The second thing, though, that we wanted to do was to actually revisit that model I mentioned at the beginning of using the human classification to create classified data with the idea that the machine was going to replace the humans. Because you could imagine that that would be the logical extreme for this model, is that as the machine learning model got better and better, eventually we wouldn't need people anymore. We wanted to actually look at closing the loop where we could have the machine learning help the humans to improve. And the way we are doing that in the current system is by using some of those images that the machine is more confident about and providing those as training examples for new volunteers. So in particular, if you're a new volunteer and you come to the system, you won't see all 20 images that need to be, all 20 classes of glitch to classify, and you won't also see things that are particularly difficult. Instead, the system will use the machine learning to pick out images that seem more likely to be of the class and to be of a subset of classes. So in particular, you'll start off as a beginner on the left here doing the verification I mentioned. So you'll have the most obvious glitches and a subset as well. And then once your performance at those is good, and it seems like you have mastered those, you can be given more of the different kinds of glitches to classify and eventually work your way up to where you're being given the glitches which, in fact, the machine has no idea about. So in particular, were you to go to Gravity Spy right now, and it's, by the way, gravity-spy.org, and it's in beta mode now, so anyone who wants to try it out is welcome to do that. It should be launching publicly next week, so you can be looking for that as well. But as I said, were you to go there now, you would in fact be given the beginner workflow where you're only given images that the machine is reasonably confident are of either blip or whistle, and you can see those are two very distinctive looking kinds of glitches. And you have a simpler interface where you're just making the decision between those two. And in a sense, this gives you a chance to learn how the system works, but also to really experience those two classes and to master them. And then within a few classifications, once you're doing well with those, you would be moved up to the next workflow where there'd be a few more kinds of glitches, and then eventually to the full-blown interface with all 20. So that's actually one way that we're using the machine learning to sort of take the effort of the volunteers and to make sure that that's being spent on things that really need a human's kind of insight by taking the ones that the machine is relatively confident of and basically, as I said, in this case, using them for training. The second thing, though, that we wanted to do is to allow the volunteers to get involved in a more creative kind of work, where, again, it is something that you can't easily automate. And in particular, as I mentioned at the beginning, in the LIGO system, it's expected that there's actually more kinds of glitches than the 20 or so that are currently incorporated in the system. And as well, because the system is constantly being tinkered with, it's expected that some glitches will get eliminated, which is part of the goal of this project, to identify glitches that can just be fixed and taken out of the system, but that might in turn lead to a new kind of glitch that hadn't been seen before. So it's necessary for that categorization to evolve. And that's something which normally, well, in a lot of systems you wouldn't expect. No one is really expecting, for example, that in the Serengeti, there'll all of a sudden be entirely new species that no one had seen before. But it's also something where we wanted to make that possible for the volunteers to get involved. And so the idea here is that our well-trained volunteers who've been involved, who've mastered the current set, would also be able to look through the images, and in particular, the glitches that the machine learning does not have a very good categorization for, that doesn't really look like anything that's been seen before, in order to identify new categories of glitch. So we are actually, even in the beta system, already seeing volunteers doing some of that. There's a facility in Zooniverse projects of creating collections. So people have made these collections of different kinds of images that they think are similar, just manually. And so we would like to be able to support that better. That's part of the project that we're just getting involved with, just starting on this year. And again, this is a place where the machine learning might be able to offer some support. So for example, just like common desktop photo managers will look through all of your pictures and try to identify the same face in different pictures, you could imagine the system looking through your collection of glitches. So you've made a collection of glitches that you think are similar, and trying to find other examples that look like that one. Or even proposing a group of its own and having the humans modify that and refine it as part of the process. So part of what we want to look at is, in terms of supporting this new kind of knowledge creation, basically, how the machine learning can support that process. We also want to use the machine learning to support explorations of more kinds of data. So the various spectrograms I've shown you are just looking at one channel of data from the system, which is this gravitational strain, the change in distances. And that, in a sense, is the most interesting because that's the scientific output of the system. But it turns out that, as you might expect in a system which is 4 kilometers long, there's lots and lots of other data that are being collected. And in fact, the data in these other channels, things about, when different parts of machinery go on or off, or when different kinds of environmental effects are detected and so on, those turn out to be quite important for the project scientists when they're debugging glitches. So, for example, there was a case where the people at LIGO were trying to track down a particular kind of glitch, which looked like this one. You can see a 50 hertz signal. This is using an older color map, which is why it doesn't look exactly the same, but same kind of idea. So the red is a more intense signal. And it turns out that they were able to correlate the occurrence of that glitch, so those are the little red dots in the bottom figure there, with another time series, which turned out to be whenever an air compressor turned on. So when one of the air compressors would turn on, very often this particular glitch would arise. And so someone went out and had a look at the air compressor and discovered that, sure enough, the rubber isolation on that compressor had broken down. So the compressor was just sitting on the ground, and which meant that every time it turned on, it would send a bit of jolt into the ground, which created this glitch. And so that's an example where you can actually go out and fix the glitch by fixing that isolation. So we would like to provide support for our volunteers to be able to look through the same kinds of other data that the system is already collecting in order to make these sorts of inferences about causality. So not just glitches that look alike phenomenologically, but which maybe, in fact, have the common underlying cause. The problem is that there are on the order of 100,000 of these channels. So just an enormously huge data set to try to troll through. And therefore, it's clear we're going to need some kind of machine support to make that possible. So to be able to identify which of these channels is worth looking at, and of course, if you think about statistical significance, if you've got 100,000 other channels, and you said you wanted things that correlated at p.05, that's going to give you about 5,000 possibilities just by chance, because 5% of 100,000. So, so obviously there needs to be something more sophisticated in order to help with this sort of data manipulation. So the challenges for the coming year, there are some that we have, I think, a pretty good handle on, like how the classification might work. I didn't mention it, but we also want to support collaboration amongst volunteers, which is not, which is common in some kinds of citizen science, but has not really been a feature, or at least an explicit feature in the Zooniverse projects. It happened a lot informally through talk channels and such, so we want to think about ways that we can make that a little more explicit. And then ones, for example, around the data, fusing all these different sources of data, which seem quite challenging and where we're still just getting started on that. But just to summarize, we've often thought about science as something that scientists do. Citizen science makes it clear that there's this, real possibility for involving volunteers in data collection and data analysis, which are the two that I showed. But there's a lot of interest in those other aspects of the process, formulating questions, applying the answers, and so on. But I think the interesting potential for the future is when we consider that some of the volunteers may actually be bots. So basically these machine learning algorithms that are going to be part of the team. And at the moment, our ways of thinking about that are fairly constrained. Replacing the volunteers with machine learning algorithms is a typical one. But thinking about how we can actually have mixed teams where there's some kind of collaboration, where there's some mixed initiative between the ideas of the machine learning supported systems and the volunteers. And I think also a very rich set of questions around the impacts that we'll have. One of the things we're very worried about, for example, is that the volunteers will feel that if we can train a machine learning system to do what they're doing, that means that they're somehow not needed anymore. And as a result, would be very discouraged from contributing to the system, which obviously we wouldn't want. We're all, questions around how you give feedback based on the machine learning, whether you can use that to give feedback to the volunteers on their performance, whether that will, in fact, end up training them in a way that you don't want, replicating the kinds of biases that are built into the machine learning and replicating that in the volunteers instead, that's a big concern, or just, as I said, being demoralizing. So I think as we start to build these kinds of systems, there's a rich range of possible impacts that we can explore. But I'm actually very excited about studying this particular setting because it seems like the kinds of issues that are arising in the citizen science one are issues that are going to arise in a lot of other kinds of work as well. The increased ability of basically these artificial intelligence systems is being seen in a wide variety of domains. I think it's inevitable that we're going to have these kinds of mixed teams applied in a lot of other kinds of settings as well. And so understanding how well that works and the kinds of principles behind designing these sorts of systems, I think will have broad applicability and potential to help us mitigate some of the impacts that these sorts of mixed environments may have in the future. So with that, I will conclude and turn it over to our hosts for the question and answer period. I look forward to your questions and your comments.
Kevin, thank you so much for that talk. It's really interesting stuff. We have a few questions here, and I am going to start. We actually have 3 questions that came from the same person, from Stan Ahalt, who's here with the NCDS. So I'm going to read the first one, let you answer it, and they're related, and then we'll go on to the next one, and then if we're getting other questions, we'll go on to those too. So, first question is, will citizens be able to see the glitch time sequence as well as the frequency plot?
In the current system, they can't. They can only see the spectrograph. And one of the questions for the future is whether there are other modes of presenting the data that would be more enlightening. But the current design of the system is just presenting spectrograph.
Okay. Related question is, do glitches occur at higher frequencies also?
They might do. So I have to say, the exact technical details I'm a little less certain about. But the LIGO detector is particularly sensitive in that range that I mentioned. Basically, it overlaps with human hearing. If you go to the LIGO site, for example, you can actually hear a recording of what the collapsing black hole sounded like. It's sort of a and so it's that frequency band that they're most worried about the glitches, because that's, if you will, that's the band in which they're doing their observations. So if there were glitches that were that had a lot of higher frequency components, in a sense, it doesn't get in the way of the functioning of the machine for doing the gravitational wave observation, and so they don't seem to be as worried about it. And actually, I think I should also note that I'm pretty sure that the signal that comes off of it is actually digitized, and so there's going to be some cutoff frequency in terms of how high of a frequency it's actually able to record. I actually don't know the bit rate, but that does imply, because it's a quantized signal, that there is some upper limit to the frequencies that it's even recording.
I would rate it. Okay. Just a couple comments from the person who gave you these questions. One comment is, if we have time frequency signals, we could listen to the waveform, and that might be another way to identify glitches?
Yeah, you know, that actually was suggested at one point, that that instead of relying on vision, you could rely on audio. And I think it is very interesting that that it may be that for some of the volunteers, audio would be a preferred mode, or that a combination of video and audio could be quite useful. And actually, that would be interesting because it would open up the project to, for example, people with sight impairments. The Zooniverse project does have a couple of other projects that rely on sound. There's one called Bat Detective, where you're actually listening to recordings of bat calls in order to identify, I believe it's to identify the species of bat. And it was interesting that the experience with the audio projects is that they have not been as successful. And one hypothesis is that many people are doing the classification in an environment where sound would be a distraction, like, you know, doing it on the subway on the way home or something like that, or doing it while you're in the room with other people, where being able to listen to the other people is important. So, so yes, I agree that it's a very interesting possibility. It's one that we haven't really explored, and there is something going on with audio that I don't think we completely understand. So. Definitely an interesting area to follow up.
Okay, we have another question here. Are there possible earth crust / magma cyclic phenomena that might also be captured?
Yes, so it's definitely the case that the system is very sensitive to earthquakes. Basically, if an earthquake is detected, then you more or less stop gathering data because it's going to totally interfere with the signal. I think my impression is that the system is so sensitive that it's basically overkill for trying to detect terrestrial events, because basically those just totally swamp it. So if you're really interested in, you know, movement of the crust, that would certainly show up in this system, but in a way that's probably not very useful for science. That's, again, that's my impression from what I understand about how the system works.
Okay. Does anyone else have a question at this time? Going once, going twice? Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions at this time. So we will wrap things up. Kevin, I want to thank you today for a wonderful presentation. We really appreciate your time as well as the time of our attendees. And for those of you in the audience, please remember that DataBytes is a monthly lunchtime webinar series, or at least lunchtime if you're on the East Coast. Our next session will be Wednesday, November 2nd at noon Eastern Time, and it will feature Chris Beal of MCMC, talking about data-related security issues. We hope you can join us then, and thank you very much. Thank you again, Kevin. Everybody have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much for having me. It was very interesting to be here, and thanks also for the questions. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Did we miss?